where I'm from has been constantly changing throughout my life. I have lived from corner to corner, coast to coast, north to south in this country. Maine to Los Angeles, Florida to Seattle, Minneapolis to Houston, Washington, D.C. to the Rocky Mountains. It has been a fun ride in many respects, and I think one of the reasons is that God made me to enjoy changes and changing. And He gave me a wife, a life partner, who enjoyed it as well. I can summarize my life by simply saying I've had 3 careers. First, as a protocol officer for NASA during the years that we were landing on the moon, all the way through the first space shuttle tests out in the deserts of California. Secondly, we spent 18 years as missionaries in the United States to international students who were studying here. Some 500,000 international students come here from countries around the world, and the idea is that if we encourage American families here to befriend a student, many of those coming into the orbit of the gospel will actually become Christians and can return to their homelands as missionaries to their own people. And then at midlife, about age 45, God let me finally get into seminary. I say finally because I tried a couple of times before and He said, not the right timing. Of course, I didn't realize at the time, so when I finally got to go through and got into graduate school for a Master's of Divinity degree, it then permitted me to be ordained as a pastor in the Presbyterian Church of America. And I completed about 15 years of pastoring and then retired in Seattle. I told my wife it was now her turn to choose where we live because she'd follow me everywhere. And she simply said, "Where are the grandchildren?" Well, they were all on the East Coast, and that's how we've ended up here.
That is really cool. That's definitely sounds like a journey.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you were born?
I was born in Virginia someplace. I'm told it was, my parents lived in Newport News. I was born in the Naval Hospital at Hampton. And at age 1, there's a picture of me standing next to a snowman about my height out on the end of Long Island near Montauk. And then 2 years later, we're up in upstate New York, in Watertown, Adirondacks, and my twin sisters were born, 3 years younger than I. We moved to Maine from there. From there, moved to Panama City, Florida. Dad was in the Air Force, so they move you around every couple of 3 years. My experience at age 6 was to have lived in northern climates the whole time. So as soon as we drove under the beach in Panama City and I saw that crystal white sand, which is unique to that coastline there, the only thing in my experience that looked that white was snow. I thought it was snow. It was charming. From there to Minneapolis, where we stayed. Dad retired from the Air Force after 20 years, and I graduated from high school in Minneapolis. Began 5 days later at Florida State University. I decided the warmer climates seemed like a good idea. Dad liked it too. He moved to Houston shortly after I started at Florida State. And I spent 2 years at FSU and then got a summer job as a tour guide at the NASA Space Center, called the Manned Spacecraft Center at the time, now the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center. It turned into a 9-year career with NASA in public affairs work, and I got to be there during NASA's most exciting period, the 6 landings on the moon and the Skylab space station, 3 flights, the Apollo-Soyuz joint mission with the Russians, and finally, as the protocol director for the Dryden Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where we tested the early space shuttle by putting it on top of a 747 and taking it up to altitude, popping it off and letting it glide to its landing on the lake bed. Mm-hmm.
I remember learning about that in school, so
Mm-hmm.
what was it like experiencing that? You know, like especially for the moon landings or
Yeah.
Skylab, all these like historical moments.
It's
That's crazy.
all I can think of is exciting. I mean, the first summer, I'm 19 years old. not quite halfway through college, and I'm witnessing firsthand being on the very cutting edge of technology and manned exploration. I mean, we hadn't had days of exploration to compare to that since Columbus discovered the New World and the century that followed that. And this was a completely new world, of course. Now, during the decade prior to this, the United States and the Soviet Union had been making efforts to get man into space with the whole idea of going to the moon. And it was a race to the moon. Whatever else may have come from that, it was critical at that time in our history that the United States win the race to the moon. And we were able to do just that. The story of how it happened is quite remarkable. But for me, being dropped in the months just before the first moon landing was very exciting work, and probably the closest I came in my personal brush with history was being in the Mission Control Center viewing room, behind all of the monitors and the engineers out there monitoring the flight, communicating with the spacecraft and the astronauts, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were walking around on the moon. I was there as a protocol escort on standby to Wernher von Braun in case he needed to go anywhere. And of course, von Braun's going nowhere. That was the pinnacle of his career. So just to be present at that filled me with excitement. Probably it's been in the years since then that I've appreciated that opportunity, because our efforts to explore space like that came to an end. And no longer were we as a nation or as a human race as compelled to continue that exploration at the time. Part of it, I think, is because the technology needed to be developed much further to do that. And it amazes me as I look back on it now that with what little technology, and particularly computer technology, we had available, that we were able to make those 6 successful flights without any loss of human life in space. Not forgetting the Apollo astronauts who died atop their vehicle, testing it on the ground before we actually got Apollo into space. Exciting stuff.
Very exciting. And then after 9 years at NASA, you moved on to international ministry, correct?
We did. It was interesting. My job at the Space Center in California, up in the high desert there, was supposed to open the doorway to me just really getting on the beam for a skyrocketing ride into more important and more impressive jobs. But God had other plans. In the same church service where we heard a missionary speaker, my wife and I, at the same time, unknown to one another, felt a strong, compelling call from the Holy Spirit to leave that and to go into Christian work. Well, I wasn't quite sure what. Earlier, a couple of years before I was married, God had turned down the idea of me going to seminary. So I thought, well, that's not it. And I thought, well, what can a protocol officer do in ministry? So when we talked to the speaker that night, he says, talk to the people that you already know in ministry. God has likely already introduced you to the organization, the ministry that you'll be working with. And so we did. And one of those 3 was the Ministry of International Students Incorporated, known as ISI, based in Colorado Springs. The president of the organization brought me on to be his assistant, and in the 18 years that followed, I never had the same job for any 2 years in a row. God created me to like change, and even in that, everything was constantly changing. In fact, you could almost say that my role was that of a change agent, helping to bring about new ministries and get things started and change things in other areas. And I could go through a list of things that I was able to do. But the remarkable thing to me also is the fact that I stayed in it. It shows to me the power of God's Spirit to convict the heart. I spent 6 months raising my own support. I took a 50% cut in pay for my work with NASA, and then I had to raise the money myself. And then, having started, 3 months after that, I got a call from one of the men I worked with at NASA. He had been promoted to be the deputy director of the Kennedy Space Center. And he said, "John, you remember that conversation that we had last year? The position's opened up, and I'm now able to offer you the position of protocol director for the John F. Kennedy Space Center." A very prestigious position, quite a rise, especially for someone who was 28 years old. Without skipping a beat, the conviction that God had planted in my heart was so strong. I said, "Jerry, thank you so very much. I appreciate this, but I've already taken another position." I have a nephew by marriage who also had a similar experience. I discovered very recently that just as his company was about to promote him, he responded to a call of God to leave that company. I mean, they were offering him a big promotion, and to start a ministry to inner city kids playing baseball in Austin, Texas. And his boss ended up being the chairman of his board. Interesting how God does that. But to me, this is significant because it happened to me, and I'm not alone in this. I never thought that I was unique in that respect. God will do that to people that He wants to draw in. What surprises me is how easy it was for me to turn down that incredible offer. I didn't blink. I didn't wonder. And ever since then, I look back on that and realize that God indeed had promised to lead me throughout life. And this was one of His ways of doing it and making it certain. I always prayed to God, don't give me any choices. In this case, He did give me a choice, but He also gave me the grace and strength to say, no, I'm sticking with the course that I've been set on now.
Yeah. And looking back from where you are now, I'm sure you see way more of how God's led you. But I'm sure like during that time, it must have been very difficult. And for me, so many people that I know, we're going through this process and we're young.
Yes.
We're in our 20s and we don't know anything. Knowing what you do know now, what do you wish you knew kind of at that time of transitioning and making decisions? Is there anything that you felt like, I wish, this is what I would say to, my younger self at that time?
One thing I do know, and one thing I wish that I had known. At the time, my conviction of God's faithfulness in leading me, as He promised when I was an 11-year-old boy who simply responded at a Billy Graham evangelistic meeting in Minneapolis, to go forward and to commit my life to Christ. Part of that call, the specific nature of it, was to establish this relationship with God who would guide me through life. And at the time, as an 11-year-old boy, I thought, who wouldn't want that? And He continued to do it. Now, that sustained me through all kinds of things. And I knew that, and that conviction is strong. But the thing I did not know and did not come to realize until midlife, that I wish I had known at the time, is the effect that the sin nature has on the human soul and on the mind.
Yeah.
Here's what I mean by that. Up until my mid-40s, I would picture the whole idea of sin and sinfulness as having to do with the things on the outside that I did to people. I knew I could have sinful thoughts and this and that and the other. One of the things that helped me when I was studying counseling at the time was recognizing that sin is something in us that changes the beauty of how God created us as individuals, twists it, shall we say, essentially to say it's all about me. Sin is an inward thing that has its roots wrapped around the core of my being in such a way that I hardly even recognize that it's working. Now, what's the practical application of this? One of the people that I've read has described sin as an essential self-centeredness. It's kind of like what the temptation was in the Garden of Eden, to Eve and to Adam. Now, there's no piece of fruit so good looking that it would cause Eve and Adam to give up all that they had with God. What was the temptation? The temptation, the lie that Satan had given, was that we could be like God, knowing good and evil, and by that meaning being so intimately acquainted with and connected to the power to establish what is, that whatever is the way that I see things is the way they are.
Is the right way, yeah.
That's the right way.
Yep.
And if anyone sees it differently, well, they're just wrong. And when I get down to it at a basic human level, that is one of the primary reasons of conflict between individuals and even nations, is because we think the way we see it is the way that's right and that it ought to be done. So it was that realization that helped me to see that I could not rid myself of the sin that was in me, even if I could control my behavior on the outside, which at the time, people would look at that and say, well, he is an excellent Christian.
He's a good boy.
He's a good boy. One of the interesting things that helped me to realize how insidious this was, this whole concept of sin in a person, was probably the one book that I have referred to more than any other book in my lifetime, other than the Bible. And it is a simple book that describes the Myers-Briggs temperament sorter. Some people would say it's a personality test. The professionals would call it an instrument. Whatever it is, it helped to show me the vast variety of personalities that there are, and helped me to realize that out of 100 people, only 5 would see the world through the same eyes that I did.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even their backgrounds and experience would make it slightly different than mine because it was particular that way. And suddenly things started happening to me and I realized, wait a minute, God made me this way, so that's the way I see it, but it's not the only way to see it. It changed my marriage. It didn't happen instantly, but over time I began to see, I really don't want to try to change my wife or train her to be more like I am. I really should want her to be the best expression of herself. Yeah. And there are often times that I would look at things that she was not able to do. I happen to have a very good sense of spatial relationships and such like that, in ordering the outside world. She is extremely adept in the world of persons and personalities. She can read a situation and people so well. Like I can look around and manage to relate to the physical world very well. The crazy thing is that my trying to make her more like me would diminish those skills of hers. But not only that, God would tell me, He says, John, I'm not trying to change her to do this. If she can't do something, why do you think I put her with you? You're supposed to do that. Yeah. You together will make a more complete person, so to speak. Yeah. And that helped me, that personality instrument, if you will, helped me to recognize that in a very practical way, there are dozens of different ways people can look at the same thing. So my job as a person is not to get conceited about the fact that my way is the only way, or even the best way. That helped me in relationships with other people. This whole idea of authority. Whoever's been given the authority, they make the calls. Even if they see it differently than I am, my job is to support them. And vice versa. If I'm the leader in this management effort, then I've got the ball. They need to support what I'm going to do on that. So it has very practical implications in relationships to people. And then later in life, when at age 50 I was ordained as a minister and began to take on pastorate of churches that were having difficulty, one of the reasons I could do that was because I wasn't entering the ministry as a 28-year-old man. I knew what Christians were capable of doing to one another. I knew the sin that Christians are capable of in spite of our commitment, in spite of our best efforts to be the best follower of Christ we can be. We can't get past that essential self-centeredness. And so while I knew we can't live that way, and we should not, and as Christians we were to grow together in love and in our following of Christ, it didn't shock me when people showed that they were not able to do that well. That is just our state. We have to wait till heaven when we are removed from that sin nature completely, and we can enjoy one another thoroughly with the proper perspective that only God can have.
Definitely. Speaking of the Myers-Briggs, I am familiar with that, and in my college community, it's almost a joke at this point because some people are like very obsessed with it. I'm very knowledgeable about it just because it's like so many people around me talk about it all the time. And so it was really cool that you brought that up. One thing that my friends and I have discussed in the past is on the subject of our sin nature and personalities, all of our different personalities. When do you think there is a line where do you think there is a line between our sin nature and our personality? Because some people can say, "Oh, I am shy," and that means I don't talk to people, and that can very easily cross into, you need to make some effort to do that. And that was just an interesting topic that was.
We can always slip into the mistake of using our weaknesses as an excuse to do something we don't want to do. On the other hand, there are many times when I have advised an extroverted wife in counseling to give her introverted husband an opportunity to recover from his hard day at work before she drags him off to a party. And then don't drag him into conversations with people, because if he had a little battery meter on there, she'd see the battery being drained and drained and drained and drained. So the better part of wisdom is for her not to assume that her extroversion and her wanting to talk and everything should trump his desire to be alone. Rather, if she will allow him to simply recharge his batteries at the party by finding another introvert, while the two other introverted guys will stand there and just not say a word but exchange grunts with one another and have a perfectly great time, then he will be in position where she can take him to more parties and he won't resist as much. So there's a case where if she takes care of him and recognizes what he's like, then she will be in a better position to get to do some of the things that she wants to do. It's a matter of respecting each other in marriage, to be able to help each other become the best version of ourselves.
Definitely.
Yeah. That's at least one illustration I can think of, but
that's a good one. That's a good one. Changing subjects a little bit. Corrie ten Boom is one of my personal childhood heroes. I grew up reading The Hiding Place. It was really cool, hearing your class debate it, or speak about it just now. What was it like knowing Corrie ten Boom personally in person? What was it like working with her? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. In this case, I was 20 years old, still quite new to life, still exploring the exciting things. My mother, who has a lot of promotional skills and abilities, was invited by some folks in Houston to set up Corey's speaking tour in the Houston area. Well, and to get her from place to place, they needed a driver. I got to be that driver. And so that's how I got to know Corey, is that she came to Houston in 1970, spent a couple of weeks speaking at a dozen or so different events, and most of those I got to hear and sit through. So I heard her story again and again. Corey was an interesting person. This is later in her life, of course. It was about 25 years after she had been released from prison, and so she was much older, I think somewhere in her 70s at that point. And the interesting thing is that Corey was a very serious person. And I realize now, with a chance to look back on this and now reading her book again, it had just come out a year or two before, in 1970. And I can look back on this and understand why she was serious. She was on a mission. She had no marriage, she had no children, she was not distracted by anything else in life. She could focus on her mission. Now, she's as tender and precious as could be, but her life was always lived in the arena of the importance of things, the importance, those important things in life that you need to focus on, that all of us do from time to time as we pause in between the busy moments of just living life and taking care of things like that. So I heard her speak again and again about her experience. I got a chance to give her a tour through the Space Center where I worked. That was my domain. And she inscribed one of her books to me and said, "To John Rantal, with whom I went to the moon, he knew the way. Praise to him who is the way." So Corey-like, always turning it back to Jesus and to God the Father and his care for us in that sense. I had a chance to meet Corey later in life a couple of times. Once when it was 4 years later, when I had graduated from college and I was part of my church's youth group sending a team of 20 youngsters over to Germany to help with an outreach in a small German town to the youth in that area. And on the way, we stopped by Holland, and I took 5 or so of the students with me, and we went to her apartment during the time in Harlem when they were filming the Hiding Place movie. And so we had a chance to talk with her there, and she realized she had just an hour with us. So again, the talk was all about things that were important. She was seeing, what can I pass on to these young people who are just starting to learn about the World War and the things that happen there and what God can do in their lives too. And then finally, we got to meet her after our first baby was born. I wrote Corey in Holland, thinking she was still there, and asked her, would you tell me, is there a longer form of your name? We've named our first child, our daughter, Corey. And she says, yes, the longer name is Cornelia, after the female version of Cornelius. Yes. And she said, but I'm not, the letter came back from Orange County, California. Well, that's my last year with the space program. We were up in the high desert above Los Angeles. So I wrote her back quickly and said, can we come just see you and take a little picture with our Corey and your Corey? And she did. And I recall that my daughter, first daughter, Corey, was sitting in her lap. And Cindy was over there as I was snapping her with pictures, and she, smile, Corey, smile. And Corey ten Boom looked at the little 5-month-old infant. She said, they want you to smile, but we know that the world is a very serious place, isn't it? So that was the milieu in which Corey lived at that time, was the seriousness and the importance of things related to the gospel.
Last questions I want to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're known as Papa John.
Yes.
I know he is Papa John. And can you tell us how you got here to where you're Papa John? You're teaching my brother's class.
This is a class of homeschoolers using the classical conversations community model. So once a week, these 8th graders, in this case 13-year-olds, get together, having done all of their studies at home, and my job as a Challenge B tutor is to get them together basically to celebrate what they've learned and also to help them along in their studies as I can. I'm not their teacher. Their parents are their teacher. My job is to make what they're doing and learning more fun. And I'm thinking, I can do that. I've actually discovered that I have a love for this age that I didn't realize before. It enables me to let the kid in me outside to play, and at the same time I can be like that older or oldest brother or older uncle in a way. See, in my mind I still don't think of myself as 70 years old, but I am. To be the one to help them see the path that's ahead of them and the exciting stuff going on and the important things of life. You know, I refer to my girls as those who are women of excellence and the young men as men of honor. It's an important transitional time in their life, and I've discovered that they respond well to my crazy personality, playing everything from rock music to opera in between the class sessions and things like that, and just I'm enjoying the freedom of being myself without feeling like I have to impress anyone.
Yeah.
And it's taken a lifetime to get to that point.
I love that. I love that. And it's a huge inspiration for, I think, me and just a lot of young people just to, be passionate and pursue things. And working with young people, I personally work in education as well. And it's a big challenge these days for me to motivate students a lot of times. So many kids these days are just, motivated by themselves, pleasure, not really motivated to learn. What have you found to be helpful in motivating your students or the people you've worked with?
I can't claim any great experience as a classroom teacher. As a pastor, and prior to that as a layman, I did a lot of teaching. But teaching teenagers, young teens, is not something I have great experience in. And so I can't say, oh yeah, this works, I've done it for years. I haven't done it for years. But I have discovered in these first 2 years that one of the things that I can do to help inspire them is in 2 areas. Number one, just to sell them the idea, this is good stuff. Number two, to look for something in each student that God has created and already placed there that inspires them. I have one student, not in this class, but in the second community that I tutor in, who for the last year and a half I've been unable to get him engaged. Not that it's my job, but you certainly want to try as a tutor. He is smart as a whip. He knows this stuff, and he won't study because there is no intrinsic motivation, nothing that drives him. And then not long ago, I discovered an area that absolutely caught him on fire. In the area, let's say, it sparked a fire, and it's still starting to flame up in the area of debate and speaking like this. And it's an area where he can use his quick wits and the ability to think on his feet to form arguments in the middle of a debate sequence that succeed. And suddenly he's discovered a love for that. That is the toehold that I want for him. I feel confident as the years go on that the right vision of what he can do and become will be that which continues to inflame his learning and motivate his discipline. I've often realized that I really don't want to spend time studying or learning anything unless I'm going to get to use it for something. So to me, that goal that is beyond just the learning itself. It's what motivates me to get that done. If I want to reach there, I will go through all kinds of effort to do it. And so I'm assuming that in many respects, every other student is like that. They need to be motivated by something greater than what they have at the moment to enable them to take the steps on that. So that's been my experience so far, is to try to find that with each of my students and to affirm with each of them, all right, all of you are different. Some of you are better writers, some of you are better with math and science and so on like this. The important thing in our class here is that we celebrate what God has given you your greatest strength at and develop that, but also help you along with the others and let you see there are great and good things to be learned there as well. So I try to look for that in the individuals. What's there that can be motivated? Where can vision be sparked and inflamed?
Definitely. And just closing us out, working with all these young people, working with many people, past as a pastor and in ministry, what will you want to, is there something that you want to leave to the next generation with young people now? Is there something that you feel like is the most important that you want to pass on to them?
Absolutely. And I know what it is. I start with my life verse, Philippians 1:6. He who began a good work in you will continue it until the day of Jesus Christ. God is faithful to keep His promises to us. My message to them is, you can trust Him. You can trust Him in everything. Life will not be pleasant at every turn. There'll be times when people throw you under the bus. There'll be times of great exhilaration and celebration and joy. And in the midst of it all, God will be faithful to lead you and to provide everything you need in order to bring you to the point where, at the end of your life, whether it be facing the Lord Jesus in heaven when you awaken there, or whether He comes back before your death, you can look forward to His embrace, His joy, and His looking at you and saying, well done, good and faithful servant, as you look back in His eyes with your face full of tears and saying, but it was you who did this. You led me in the way. And I'm so grateful.